Okay. Madam Chair, we are live. Okay. Madam Chair,
Yes.
Next one.
Going back to
Yes.
1876 again.
I know.
Yep.
Isn't that funny?
Big
That
year.
year. It was a big year.
We
Are we
like those, we like those green signs.
You guys?
Yeah.
Oh, great.
Sorry.
No problem. All right, folks, welcome back to the January 22nd meeting of the House Energy and Digital Infrastructure Committee. We are moving on from utilities to telecommunications. I'm Representative Kathleen James.
Scott Campbell from St. Johnsbury.
Richard Bailey, Lamoille 2, Hyde Park. Chris Morrow, Wyndham, Windsor, Bennington.
Michael Southworth, Caledonia 2.
Christopher Howland, Rutland 4.
Darren Torrey, Washington 2.
Graham Kleckner, Burlington.
Morris Billy, London 2.
Jack Locker, Committee Assistant.
Great, and Gabrielle? No,
Claire.
Claire.
Claire Buckley from Leland Public Affairs, and the client that I have that has an interest on this topic is CTIA, which are the wireless carriers.
Thank you so much. All right, for the record.
For the record, I'm Maria Royal with Legislative Council. And we are now going to do an overview of telecommunications regulation in Vermont. By that I mean telephone, voice service. We'll save broadband for our final presentation. And in terms of what I hope to cover in this presentation, in addition to whatever questions you may have, is an overview of the regulatory framework, which is extensive with respect to telecommunications. Who the regulators are in Vermont, what the market looks like in Vermont, what some of the regulations actually are, some of the state's goals with respect to telephone, mobile service in particular, the build out of mobile coverage, various programs and services that the state has, as well as just touch on some of the emerging issues in this world. And so the early years, and so going back to 1876 for a moment. We're starting in the same year we started our last presentation, and really just to kind of give historical context, because you're going to be able to see how the common law, the judicial decisions, the regulatory authority, they're all kind of proceed in parallel with respect to different industries. So 1876, that's when the Green case, Munn versus Illinois, was being decided. That very same year, Alexander Graham Bell patents the very first telephone and starts the Bell Telephone Company, and had a patent until 1894. And then AT&T, I'm mentioning, I typically don't like to mention specific providers, but they have played such a central role historically, and we'll talk about that in a couple of places. That AT&T was a subsidiary of the Bell Telephone Company and then became the parent company. As new companies were able to enter the market, AT&T bought up a lot of its competitors, and that becomes important momentarily. In terms of the regulation of telephone, in 1910, Congress established the Federal Interstate Commerce Commission already existed and regulated railroads. In 1910, they were given the authority over the telephone and telegraph industry. So, however, the local franchising is basically done at the state level. What I wanted to mention also, because this really picks up on the themes of what utility is actually In 1913, in response to antitrust investigations, they were assuming too much of the market share and monopoly status. They basically agreed to enter into what was called the Bloomsbury Commitment. They sold their Western Union stuff, and they also agreed to allow competitors to interconnect with their networks. So they provided both local and long distance, so they could not keep their large networks discrete from the new companies that wanted to offer local service. They had the internet. So at the time, this notion of a net there natural monopoly was something that was very much debated and promoted from their end, and saying it makes sense, it's more efficient if you let us be the monopoly, but we agree that we are going to allow other competitors to connect, and we'll also provide service in our service area. Right? So this was part of the discussion that was going on at that time. Then, jumping ahead to 1934, this is when the Communications Act was first adopted. This is still to this day, the regulatory framework in which we currently operate. It gives specific responsibilities that had been given to the Interstate Commerce Commission for radio telephone, as well as the authority of the Radio Services Act related to radio broadcast regulation. Combined those entries in telegraph and one entity to oversee the development of the build-out of the communications network nationwide. And there's a reason why I'm kind of grounding the law in the time, because so much of what's currently in the law is based on what the industry looked like at that time. And I'll explain a little bit more about that. But in 1934, the mission of the FCC basically was to make available as far as possible to all the people of the United States rapid and efficient nationwide and worldwide wire and radio communication service with adequate facilities at reasonable prices for the purpose of national defense. And that was later amended to say also for the protection of life and property, and also amended to say without discrimination, provide the services. But this was the original objective of the FCC. So we'll talk more specifically about how that actually functions in just a moment. But I did want to take a moment to talk about the titles of the Act, because you're going to hear reference to these titles now, and they have very real implications. So, for example, Title I, this is a provision of the Act. It's basically the general provisions. It has creation of the FCC, the purpose of the FCC, the definitions, right? There's no real regulatory authority of a particular type of service in Title I. It's the general stuff. There's a reason why I'm making that point, which we'll get to. Title II is the regulation of what are called common carriers. This is the telephone and telegraph companies. We're going to talk more about the FCC. We're going to talk about the dual jurisdiction that's inherent in this law, the way they divided what the federal government does and what the state is responsible for. Talk about both of those. We're also going to talk about the notion of what a common carrier is. What does that really even mean? And how does that apply to more advanced telecommunications services? Title I, Title II, don't forget. This is what I'm referring to. So the FCC, it's an independent federal agency. It's overseen by Congress. There are 5 commissioners. It's bipartisan. Only 3 can be of the same political party at any given time. They are appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate. The president selects the chair, and they serve 5-year terms. the reason why I wanted to kind of pause on this, well, there are two reasons. One, to just note the independent, semi-protected status of the entity. They're not like commissioners or secretaries that serve at the pleasure of the president. So they have some independence. But also with the change of administration, historically, whether it went from a Republican to a Democrat, there have been very different policy objectives. And so this entity, which has broad authority, although its jurisdictional limits, it's litigated all the time, can have consequences with who the president is and who's the chair and how they see telecom services should or should not be regulated. So I just wanted to pause on that for 1 minute. But more specifically then about this dual federal state jurisdiction, this idea of federalism as a theory of government where the federal government has some power and the state governments have some power, and how that's divided. Under the Act itself, under the Title I general provisions, it clearly states that the FCC has jurisdiction over interstate communications and states have jurisdiction over intrastate. So the local telephone companies. At that time, most of the telephone companies, most of the business was intrastate. As you can imagine, so most of them were regulated monopolies, most of them were regulated at the state level and provided intrastate service. Yes, there's long distance service as well within state and outside of state. But as you can imagine, these are networks, they're all connected. So in any network, there's going to be some intrastate component and there's also going to be an interstate. This becomes more problematic over time. Where do you draw the jurisdictional lines between the state's authority and the FCC's authority? So that's why I just wanted to pause for a minute there. Then also just to delve a little bit more deeply into this notion of common carriage. We talk about telephone companies as being common carriers, just like other common carriers in common law. As it applies, that term or that designation, how it applies to communications networks, this might be a little bit more than what you really want to know, but I actually found it, to me, it's very helpful historically to think about the context of where these terms come from. But I also want to mention Susan Crawford has done a ton of work in this sphere and has written a great law review article on, she's written many of them, but why common carriage applies to communications networks and where that comes from. And so she basically cites as one source this notion of carriers from what's called the law of bailment. And basically where a carrier of goods is responsible for the goods that it's transporting. And they have a higher standard of liability. So if you give somebody a parcel or if they transport you, they then have a standard to take care of whatever that good is while it's in its possession, right? So they have obligations and duties being a common carrier that is open to the public, available to the public. They don't actually control the content of what the parcels and the goods are or the destination, but they have responsibilities to transport. So whether you're talking about physical objects or whether you're talking about communications, voice, information, whatever, there are obligations. And then also the common carriage notion in telecom has its source in transport networks that we've already talked about, the monopolies, the railroads, similar kind of, if you're going to be providing what's considered a public service, you're a private entity, but you're providing a public service that everybody needs to be able to avail itself of, that you have obligations. serve all customers, not to discriminate, and not charge unreasonable rates. So this idea of common carriage was enshrined in the Communications Act in Title II, Common Carriers, and applied to telephone companies and telegraph companies specifically. So I'm going to, spoiler alert, when you talk about broadband service, people argue about, is it a Title II common carrier? Should it be regulated as such, or to some extent, or is it not? And basically, unregulated, whatever the market has available, basically controls.
And we'll talk about that
And we
this
will
afternoon.
talk about that, yes, but I thought
Okay.
it was important to like ground it a little bit here so that you know. So then, technologies and markets evolved. And I'm gonna add to these dates, some of the broadband related stuff, but just in the telephone world, the voice world, in 1982 was the breakup of the Bell system. So we talked about AT&T and its growth, and it had the Western Electric, the telephone equipment side of things. It had the long distance market. It had a lot of local markets. And in the early 70s, 74, the federal government started an investigation, antitrust investigation. Ultimately, it wrapped up in 1982. There was an order, the AT&T consent decree, which I think became effective in 84, where AT&T basically divested itself of its local calling exchanges. And they were broken up into, I think, 7 different regional Bell operating companies. You hear them referred to as RBOCs or Baby Bells. So they became separate entities, separate from the long distance company and services and the equipment that AT&T continued to provide. Vermont is part or was part of NYNEX, which was New York and New England combined to become one regional Bell operating company that later became Verizon. And then I don't know how much of the Verizon network was sold, but eventually in Vermont, Verizon became Fairpoint, and then Fairpoint became consolidated. So when people talk about the RBOC, the Regional Bell Operating Company in Vermont, they're talking about consolidated, and this is the history of who they are. And there's a reason why they're given that designation or treated a little bit differently than the other telephone companies that are in Vermont. And we'll talk about that also. But then significantly, competition, the first handheld cell phone, and that's Michael Douglas. That's from Wall Street. Gordon Gekko, holding the status symbol of the day. But so this was 1983. So obviously you have new services now that are suddenly becoming introduced to the market and available. 1994, I just wanted to put in here that Vermont was pretty proactive in terms of wanting to make sure that all Vermonters had access to phone service and created the Universal Service Fund and a mechanism to fund that fund, which then funded several programs like Lifeline, the Vermont Lifeline, there's a federal Lifeline, the Vermont Lifeline, which is a subsidy for low-income folks, high-cost program to provide subsidies to providers to build out in the high-cost areas, 911 to fund public safety, relay service is a service for hearing impaired. It's a particular service. So this notion that this is a service that should be available to everybody, but in high-cost areas, companies aren't naturally going to build out there, so we need to the state needs to come up with a mechanism for generating money to then pay for programs to help the build out and universal availability. We'll talk more about that financing mechanism. But I wanted you to be aware of that, and that was in 94, and then in 1995, I believe that's when the first commercial VoIP, voice over internet protocol, so voice over your broadband connection as an application became available. Again, letting you know all these things are happening in the market, which in addition to the computer broadband early days of that, but we'll talk more about that. But what this then led to in 1996 was the first major overhaul of the Communications Act, the 1934 Act that we already talked about. And what I've included here is, I believe, from the conference report from the Act. But so the goal of the Telecommunications Act of 1996 was to provide for a pro-competitive, deregulatory national policy framework designed to accelerate rapidly private sector deployment of advanced information technologies and services to all Americans by opening all telecommunications markets to competition. So the idea was there's competition. The states, the federal government should remove any regulatory barriers so that as many businesses can enter the market as possible and compete. Not unlike other sectors in the 80s and the 90s, a lot of deregulation was happening in other sectors as well, but certainly in the telecom world. And I'm just highlighting two things. There's a lot to be said about the provisions in the Act, but there are two things that do come up frequently. One is this notion of what's included in the Act is what's called the forbearance provision. So these services, the telephone service, they remain titled to common carrier services. But there's a process of deregulating, and what that means under the Act at the federal level is the FCC forbears from providing rate regulation or forbears from certain regulatory requirements, right? And it does that, it makes a decision that there's enough competition, so you don't need to regulate. When that's done at the FCC level, then the states also must forbear from that regulation. The reason why I'm pausing a little bit and talking about this, and I am jumping ahead for a minute, and we're not going to have a long conversation. When people talk about broadband, and in the context of this is an essential service, everyone should have access. You know, it should be a Title II common carrier. On the reverse side, absolutely not. Market's changing. There are lots of different modalities, right? But there is a middle ground, just like to be aware of. You could call it a Title II service, but you could forbear. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to regulate the rates. You can forbear. You can say, no, there's enough competition in this area. So this is just general regulatory discussion about how the Act, because it hasn't really been updated very recently in a way that provides clarity about how these services should be regulated going forward. So I thought it was important to pause and discuss that a little bit. And then one of the biggest components of this, opening up things to competition, all of the incumbent providers had to open up their networks and allow new entrants to connect they had to unbundle their network elements. So basically allow companies to connect to their wires and poles to provide service.
What does that mean in that context? Bundling or unbundling?
Unbundled network elements. So I believe it refers to like their circuit switching in the central office. So basically allowing other companies to place calls through their switching mechanisms, routing calls and so on.
Okay. Yeah.
But what does it mean in the context of cell phone service? So cell phone service is I guess, regulated as a telephone service, as an interstate telephone service, right?
Well, it's regulated as a telephone service. However, I think under the act itself, not the forbearance, but under the act itself, Congress said it should not be rate regulated. So it is a common,
Under the 96 telecom.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I believe so. It's under Title III, radio communications, but it references it's a common carrier service, but rate regulation doesn't apply, right? So there are limits to the regulation. But in terms of connecting with, so that might mean allowing the cell companies to be able to place calls through a competitor's network.
Yeah, that's
Right?
what I'm
Yes.
asking about, yeah.
Yeah,
So if you have a Verizon signal but an AT&T phone, you should be able to use their towers,
Yeah.
is that right?
yeah. And that also comes up with number portability.
Yeah.
I don't remember exactly when, but basically if you want to switch providers, you are allowed to take your number. They can't say we're keeping the number, right? So this idea that giving consumers as much flexibility as possible.
Can you require cell providers to provide service?
When,
Like, could we require them to provide universal service in the state?
no. You can't regulate them in that way. Like, they don't have a service territory where you say, in this area, you must connect everybody, right? Sometimes where that might come up is if they want state or federal funding. So under federal law, there's a Lifeline program, there are universal service subsidies. So if they want to be designated as an eligible telecommunications carrier, they might have some universal service obligations connected with that. And that might apply to a certain area, but the details of it, but otherwise they're private companies
They can cover who they want.
for the most part. Again, unless there are public funds involved, there's no requirement that they provide service. They can discontinue service, unlike the incumbent telephone companies, the legacy phone companies, the copper wire phone companies. They can't curtail service or abandon service unless the PUC approves of the, but we'll talk about that. That's actually an issue. That's a big issue. Yeah.
It's just, not for now, but I'd like to delve more into the obligations that AT&T has under FirstNet. But it's something.
Yep. Yep, and I think I mentioned that as something,
Okay.
an ongoing kind of, a struggle state program.
As you switch slides, we always like to have everybody in the room identify themselves. So,
And I'm Hunter Thompson, I'm the Director of Telecommunications and Connectivity for the Public Service Department. And now that we have a break, I'm gonna take this opportunity to slide.
Great, thank you.
And
All right, thanks, Maria. Onward.
I'm glad Hunter's here. He's a great resource.
Yeah.
And I know we talked about what I just asked, but
Whatever.
I need to
you
hear it
said.
again.
So we're not going to spend a lot of time. I think we're on state regulators, because you're already familiar with the PUC. I did want to talk, that's perfect timing, Hunter, about the Department of Public Service Division for Telecommunications and Connectivity, of which Hunter Wilson is the director. So what you'll probably at some point want to hear about the 10-year telecommunications plan, which is updated every 3 years. The new plan came out in last spring, June, summer of 2024. It looks out 10 years. It tries to come up with recommendations for meeting the state's goals. It does a needs assessment and inventory of kind of what the state of things are. So if you want a big picture overview of the market, what the issues are and needs are, then you'll want to hear more about what's in the plan. Actually, it's very helpful. As mentioned, they do some mapping of broadband and wireless coverage, and Hunter can talk more about the status, about especially with the wireless coverage mapping. That's been an ongoing issue recently, trying to determine where wireless coverage is. available in the state. They administer, and I'm going to talk about this later, the Universal Service Fund, that state fund that funds various programs to help bring universal service. Obviously, they do advocacy. There is a telecommunications and connectivity advisory board, but I don't know if it's been functional. I don't know if it's had enough members. It's created by statute to help to advise the department or the commissioner with respect to the plan. Not so much grants, because they don't really do grants anymore. But I think there have been issues, perennial issues recently with finding people wanting to serve. But you can get an update from the department about that. So about the Vermont telephone market. So we've already referred to, and this is just kind of getting the language, the terminology, the traditional, the legacy providers, also known as incumbent local exchange carriers, or ILECs. So this includes the RBOC, the Regional Bell Operating Company, which is now consolidated, and all of the other companies which are independent from the RBOC. So there are 8 of those. So all together, there are 9 legacy providers, and sometimes the service they provide is called plain old telephone service.
Is that illegal?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. And so I will just mention, so all of them were copper networks at one point. A lot of them, some of the companies have upgraded entirely to fiber. Some of them are in the, probably all of them are in some stage of upgrading their copper wires. Some of them have not. So that's just something to think about. They are considered, so they all have their own service territories, and they are the carriers of last resort. So anybody in that service territory who wants phone service is able to get phone service. It might be a copper wire, but they are required to provide that service. Yes.
Is there's no overlap of the service territories? They're clearly defined regional. That'd be a cool and interesting map to see.
Definitely on the department's website. Yes.
Plain old telephone service. Okay.
Yes. And I just mentioned, just so it's kind of here, there are PUC standards related to their terms of service around billing and disconnections. There's a consumer bill of rights that applies to them. I think I included that, just those bill of rights which are incorporated in the rule on the next page, just to give you an idea of some of the regulations that apply. And as I mentioned, Consolidated is the only one that's somewhat rate regulated, and it's only for their basic service, their minimum basic exchange service, and it's price capped. So they have flexibility with, up to a certain limit. They don't have to go through the whole rate proceeding, and all of the other independent companies are not rate regulated at all, but they have to comply with the service quality standards. And so all of the other carriers that aren't the legacy providers are called competitive local exchange carriers, or CLECs. And so these would be your cell phone service providers or your VoIP providers. And I don't believe there are any specific regulations that apply currently to their service quality. They do have to, recently, Vermont required them to report any outages over a certain threshold to the 911 board for public safety reasons, to make sure that, to be awareness of how many outages there are, who might be affected, who's in those areas, and so on. So I just wanted to highlight that. And then the consumer bill of rights that applies to the legacy phone providers. This was just, I took out from the rule just to give you an idea of what is included. I'm not really going to go through all of them unless you want me to. The right to know and control what one is buying, from whom one is buying, the full price of goods and services, the right to reasonable payment terms, fair treatment, etc. And again, the consumer affairs they are definitely a resource to help if there are concerns about compliance with these requirements.
I think I'll save a question about that for that
Okay.
entity. Thanks.
So I did want to include in statute, there are some goals with respect to state telecom planning, also with respect to broadband, but I just pulled out some of the ones that were specific to mobile coverage, because that was kind of the newer service that the state was looking to promote. And so some of those goals are to support the universal availability of appropriate infrastructure and affordable services for transmitting voice and high-speed data, support the availability of modern mobile wireless telecommunication services along the state's travel corridors and in the state's communities, support competitive choice and open access, and then finally support technology to improve governmental and public services, public safety, and economic development. There are other goals, and some of them more specifically related to broadband, but I just wanted you to see kind of the general goals related to mobile telecommunications service that are enshrined in statute.
And it's specific when it comes to mobile wireless that we're supporting in travel corridors and in developed communities.
That's a goal. It's a goal, and so these goals are meant to inform the state telecom plan, the 10-year plan, as well as you all in terms of your programs. And we're going to talk about some of the efforts,
Okay.
past and present.
Okay. So not everywhere.
And I think
travel corridors and in the communities.
Well, yes, and that might be a prioritization at the time. If you're
Okay.
going to start somewhere, maybe start on the corridors. But with FirstNet in particular, I mean, the goal is building out a whole radio access network that covers the whole state. Maybe not every destination, but ultimately for public safety reasons. So the programs and services, so now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Vermont Universal Service Fund, because this is that fund that was created in 1994, but still exists and has been amended a little bit. Well, it's been amended a number of times, mostly with respect to the financing mechanism. There's a universal service charge that everybody pays on their voice telephone service. And whether it's cell phone service, copper legacy phone service or voice service, every phone service, voice service, is a phone number. On the bill, you will see a charge. It used to be a percentage of your total billed amount. Last year, the legislature changed it to a flat fee. I think it's 72 cents. I can't believe I'm actually forgetting, but I worked on that for the entire session, and I'm pretty sure it's 72 cents. Okay. It was 71 for a little while, 72 cents. So for each line in service, for each voice line in service. There was a lot of discussion about the reason why they set that amount as a flat fee for each line as opposed to a percentage, because what they found is, one, some people were dropping their traditional voice service because they had cell coverage and they didn't need both. Two, if you bought voice and data from the cell phone company, what the cell phone company charged you for voice was a very small amount. And so the percentage of a very small amount meant there was less money coming to the state, right? Because it's paid by the consumer. So the providers, they don't want the consumer to pay any more than they have to. So that's part of what was happening, and that's part of why last year the legislature said, let's just make it a flat fee, and then it's going to not decline in any way. We'll know what it is based on the number of lines in service. Joint Fiscal Allowance, Ted Barnett has a great presentation about the amount of money that's raised and how much is available for each of the programs. So we already talked about some of them, the relay service, which is for the hearing impaired, Lifeline, and again, there's a federal Lifeline program, and then there's the state Lifeline program. This is the state Lifeline program. This is a subsidy just for voice service. The federal program can be used for broadband or voice. In Vermont, this subsidy is only available for voice service for low-income households. And I think it's like $4.25.
It's just for wired lines.
No, it can be for any voice service. Then last year, you also included as a program to be funded the Vermont 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline, which is a service that's available. I'm not actually that familiar with it. It's offered, I believe through the Agency of Human Services. But basically a service that members of the public can call if they need help. That, and there might be a cap on the amount of money available to fund that program, but that will take effect on July 1st of this year. 911 is by far the biggest drawer of these funds. $5 million maybe of $6 million that's raised. Those aren't actual numbers, but you get the gist of it, and that's the Public Safety Network. Barbara Neal is the executive director of the 911 board. She can talk about the budget, she can talk about the needs and the funding. I will say also, as part of the discussion last year, that 72 cents, by not having the constantly declining, there was a lot of pressure on 911. Because what was happening is the legislature was then backfilling for the shortage of funding to pay for the 911 service with general fund appropriations. So the whole, let's have a fee that can actually cover the expenses, that was part of that discussion. But anyway, there's the old traditional high-cost program, which was to build up phone service originally in high-cost areas, which was then updated to improve broadband build-out by the legacy providers. And then in 2014, 2015, you created the Connectivity Initiative, which is a grant program for broadband build-out. I don't know that there is money at this point flowing down to either of those programs. I don't think there is. However, there's a ton of federal money available that's going out. So I just wanted to mention that.
When you say broadband, do you mean cellular service as well as internet? Or
I don't think there's any funding available for the high cost or the connectivity for voice or broadband. The federal money?
No, I remember from years ago that there was precious little money or none
Yeah.
for the connectivity, but is it supposed to go? Is it supposed to be available for cellular and
No.
internet, or just, it's just internet?
Yeah, connectivity issue is just broadband.
Okay. When you say broadband, you mean internet?
Yes.
As
Yes.
distinct from
Yes.
cell service?
Yes,
Okay,
thank you.
thanks.
Yeah, broadband internet access service.
Right.
BIAS is what the federal, the FCC often refers to that.
Okay.
I just say broadband internet access, but yeah.
Yeah, because it always gets to be overlapping.
No, I appreciate that. And particularly when you're getting your phone service as an application over from your broadband provider through that connection.
And then there's internet service over cell phone towers, so.
Yeah, yes,
So,
there absolutely is. So 248A, I think we mentioned this earlier, but this is the siting and telecommunications services. This was enacted in 2007. It's a process that goes through the PUC, and it was intended to be an alternative to Act 250 permitting and local approval through local ordinances. And the idea was basically to speed up deployment, but still provide deference to the municipalities. So Ellen can tell you a lot more about this subject, but I just wanted you to be aware of, where it came from. It had a sunset initially, and that sunset has moved over the years. It's been pushed out, and I believe now it's set to sunset in July of 2026. So again, one of the tools that was enacted to provide faster deployment.
Can I ask a quick question on that? Did we have a bill last session that related, to a study?
On 248A,
Yeah, particularly on local siting and,
I'll ask Ellen. I will ask Ellen.
Last year? It was probably 2 sessions ago.
oh, it was 2 sessions.
We have to reauthorize it, agree, it sunsets.
There was a study,
I
I think.
thought it was in association with, a bill that Rep. Dolan had,
Citing.
that was, do you remember that? And I can't remember whether we passed it.
I don't know if we did. Okay.
I don't know. Ellen would have covered that, so I will ask Ellen.
All right.
So historically, I just wanted to touch on this, and I'm definitely going to talk about the Vermont Telecommunications Authority in the context of broadband as well. But this is an entity that was created in 2007 to expand both broadband and cellular coverage in Vermont. The VTA owned some fiber assets. They had state money. They were able to draw down some federal funding. They also built and owned a cell tower in the town of Bethel, and then leased out space on the tower to various the wireless providers. In addition, they gave out grants. They ran a grant program. They had authority to do loans. I don't know if they did, but the other, in terms of voice service, one of the programs that was funded was the Coverage Co. microcell program. Coverage Co. was a company that had small microcells that they attached to utility poles along the roads. And the idea, with the hope, their business plan was that the wireless providers would want to sell their service over those microcells. So they would lease service, basically. And that would be something that would be desired, that they would earn money from, and would also provide public safety assistance. Unfortunately, it didn't go well. They ran into some financial issues, and eventually part of it was they had to pay for the power from the electric utility to power the cell itself. That was more expensive maybe than they realized. They didn't get the buy-in from the wireless providers, the national provider that they were hoping for. In any event, that system ended. I don't know what happened to all of the microcells. And also in terms of just the voice, the cell service expansion, the VTA did do some grants. In particular, in 2012, $2.6 million was awarded to VTEL Wireless to build out their wireless program. Then the other issue, kind of ongoing issue in state government, has to do with public safety communications systems. And in that arena, you deal with land mobile radios for first responders, the LMRs, and making sure that they have access to cellular coverage or broadband coverage for public safety communications. And then the FirstNet wireless broadband network. This is what was mentioned a moment ago by Representative Campbell, I believe. So FirstNet is actually a federal entity, an authority. It's under the Department of Commerce, I believe. And it was created 2012, maybe, the Middle Class Tax Relief Act of 2012. And its goal was to build out basically a nationwide network for public safety purposes. And it was given, whoever got the contract to do the building at the national level and in each state, because it isn't necessarily the same, would be given money to build out this system that would be available to all first responders and public safety personnel. It could also be used for commercial purposes, but any first responder would be able to access the system. And so when I talk about the system, there was specific spectrum on the electromagnetic spectrum that was made available for these wireless communications specifically for public safety purposes. So this was a huge program. I don't remember actually how much money was appropriated, but I do recall there was some money that was allocated to Vermont to potentially choose its own vendor to build a radio access network statewide in Vermont that interconnected with the state national program, right? So, and this was maybe around 2017, where Vermont made the choice to contract with AT&T to build that radio access network. And I think the Vermont could have taken like 20-something million and gone with another vendor. There was a discussion about what was best for Vermont. Ultimately, Vermont decided to go with AT&T. So AT&T is building out that network, or has built out, and I think originally they were going to build 36 towers, which I believe they have done, but I'm not sure they've met the coverage. You should hear from the Department of Public Safety about what the status is and the coverage goals.
We will indeed. I've made a note
And the
to make sure that
contract
we get
Yeah.
DPS in for talk about FirstNet.
25 years. It's a long contract, and so, yeah, I'll get an update, because I'm just not sure.
You are talking about radio service, and I'm wondering about, that, again, that's distinct from cellular service. Is that,
No, I'm talking about cellular service, and,
okay,
but then this FirstNet service is meant to be for voice and data.
okay, see.
It's cellular service through cellular towers.
I thought you said, that's what
I
I
may
thought
have
it was, but
missed
then,
Okay.
but then I thought you said radio, so that's what,
Oh,
and there's also, whatever it's called, land,
land mobile radios,
Mobile radio,
yeah,
which I guess
yeah,
is.
interconnect with a broader cellular network, or can have the capacity to,
Okay, so that was,
yeah.
so there is a connection there.
Yeah.
Okay.
I have a lot of questions, so why don't we put FirstNet we'll put them on our list to have specific testimony about them.
That'd be great.
Okay.
And just to, this is more just for situational awareness, but also something might be interesting, that the PSAPs, the public safety answering points, when you make a 911 call, depending on where you're calling from, your call is directed to a PSAP, a public safety answering point. That's the entity that then connects you with, or connects to a dispatcher wherever you are. There's been a lot of movement, work, discussion about how to fund, how to make the systems reliable. There's the public safety task force, workforce, I can't remember, working group, actually wrote that a couple years ago, I'm forgetting. But basically looking at the system itself and how it should be financed. Some towns pay in for the service, there have been issues, so that's all I'm saying, but it's all related to 911, communications, and public safety, so I just wanted you to have that on your radar. And then finally, just wanted to touch on some of the emerging issues related to telecom. So one issue that you might hear about has to do with customer privacy. Recently, actually in April, so this was the FCC in last April, so there's a new FCC. So who, this might not be pursued in the same manner, but at least in April of last year, the FCC fined several of the national wireless carriers for selling customer location information to third-party aggregators who then sold it to companies that would like to have locations of certain individuals. That could be like a bounty hunter, for example, without the customer's consent. So there were some forfeiture orders where they were basically fined for doing this without getting consent. But this raises the whole issue of what is the responsibility about customer data. There are some rules that apply to voice providers under Section 222 of the Communications Act about not disclosing customer information, which they're in violation of. However, and the reason why I'm saying this is because Brendan Carr, who was a commissioner, who's now the chair of the FCC, didn't actually agree with these forfeiture orders, or felt that the location data had more, not to do with the telephone, it was cell phone data, but it had more to do with the broadband connection through a broadband service, which is not regulate, that privacy rules and the laws that I refer to do not apply to broadband providers. So that's when you start to get into the jurisdictional issues, particularly when you have one company that's providing several services and regulated differently, but the service is commingled. That's really where it gets to be contentious, ambiguous. Anyway, but the selling of data, geolocation data, has been a big issue of privacy concerns, however it's regulated or not.
So with regard to privacy, and I know that we have the ability to regulate for consumer protection. How does that relate to privacy in this regard?
So you absolutely have the authority to do that. And you could apply it to broadband providers or to the wireless providers, as long as it's not inconsistent with the federal law, what the privacy protections are for telephone companies. You can enact your own protections specific.
Do our protections have to be the same as the protections in other states?
That's a policy choice. That's a policy choice. Right now, in terms of what's happening at the federal level, so the FCC years ago, in 2016, adopted a privacy rule. I'm getting ahead of myself, actually. Maybe I'll pause on that.
I know. I'm getting ready to get wound up.
Yeah, okay, let's pause on that one. Let's pause on that one. Because it had more to do with broadband, jurisdiction over broadband, but that rule was then repealed. It was, again, change of administration. So there have been attempts, didn't go anywhere. Right now at the federal level, the FCC doesn't really have authority over broadband providers, but the Federal Trade Commission has authority generally over business practices and, so there's potentially some enforcement that could happen at the federal level. The state and several states have taken action. So cybersecurity is an issue with any network, and there's been a lot of attention recently given to in the supply chain equipment, foreign equipment that might represent threats to the national security. So this is again just being aware of maybe not state issues as much as national issues, but still part of the whole realm of things to consider. And then resiliency and redundancy of the networks, the network infrastructure, ensuring that the service is reliable, they aren't susceptible to outages for any reason. Battery backup is something that comes up a lot because most people,
Get the door, please, Jack.
so if you have a traditional phone line on a copper network your power goes out, your phone doesn't go out, so you can still call public safety. If you have voice over internet and you lose your power, you lose your modem, you lose your access to call public safety for help. So the FCC has promulgated requirements so that VoIP providers have to make available battery backup obligations and hopefully do some consumer education, mostly so that people understand that they have a certain amount of time. And I think it was 8 hours, might be 24 hours by now. I can't remember for sure what they're supposed to provide or make available for purchase. I can't remember that either, but that's been an issue to make sure people understand that when the power goes out, they might not have the ability to call for help and to be aware that they should, if they don't have a generator, yeah.
So, sorry, I want to make sure I'm understanding, what, if any, oversight is in place right now. So if you, to take, for example, my, region, so folks are, switching over to Fidium, right? They're switching over to fiber. And in some cases, or many cases, they're disconnecting their copper phone line. And I think many of them are not necessarily being told at the time or informed at the time, hey, if you disconnect this copper line, you are no longer going to have a landline. If the power goes out and your phone dies. So what are we requiring companies like Fidium to tell folks, if anything, right now?
I don't know what we're requiring, the state is requiring. So the FCC is requiring, they have battery backup obligations where they have to make available battery backup options that you can purchase through them and they'll install. And I believe it's for 24 hours. It's still 8? I thought, okay. However, this is an issue that's come up, and I'll have to go back and look, but Vermont, I believe, have the PUC maybe look at this issue more closely to see if there were consumer protections, consumer education, and how that could be accomplished so that people understood. So let me find that and see if it resulted in
An action.
they have to do this or, yeah.
That'd be great. I'd love to know how that all
Yeah.
wound up.
I remember talking about this years ago in energy technology. Laura would be a good source of information about this because she was wound up about that.
Yeah.
So, my question was going to be about whether that battery backup is strictly a federal prerogative, or does the state have any?
Oh, can we have more stringent
Yes,
requirements?
yes.
Let me look at that. Okay. And then finally, the last thing, and we kind of touched on this already, a lot of, I don't know so much, I don't know about Vermont, but in a lot of states, there's a lot of conversation about decommissioning the legacy infrastructure and providers. If they can't upgrade it to fiber, and it's in a high cost area where they don't want to make the investment because there are so few customers, they'd rather not provide the service. They'd rather not, they can sell the copper, which is, you can get a lot of money for copper now, and no longer have the obligations. So the issue here becomes, are there alternatives available for the people that would have been covered? And that's going to be where it really needs to be delved into. Do you have reliable cell phone service, whatever? Do you have an option? And is it reliable enough that you're willing to relieve the carrier of last resort of any obligations to provide service? I think that's all that I had on telecom.
Great. That's really fun.
I have, so we had detail in there, but the other 8 companies you talked about, they all have town-like names: Proctor, Bill, Waitsfield, Telephone. Those are all investor-owned
Those are all private companies.
private companies, they're not affiliated with the municipality like the electric companies or.
That's my understanding. I don't think there are any municipal phone companies. No, they're all private, family-owned businesses or,
They just share town names
yeah,
in their
yes,
titles.
yeah. I can say that confidently, under nodding his head.
I thought that was the case, but
Great. All right. Absent any further questions, I think we can go off live and why don't we reconvene at 11:20 for our committee discussion of our guiding principles. And thank you so much for being here. We will see you, this afternoon
Okay.
for broadband. This is extremely helpful.
Oh, good.